us here today. And to you, all the guests who are joining us here today, and of course to those of us who are joining us online. I'm very glad to say the seminar is being live streamed on Zoom and on MISTRA's YouTube channel, MISTRA South Africa. If you are online, you're welcome to post your questions on the chat throughout the webinar. If you are online, you're welcome to post your questions throughout the webinar. They'll all be read, or some of them will be read out at the end when we have our discussion, but you can post questions as you think. And we'd also love it if you'd post about this launch on social media. Please use the hashtag Age of Disasters or MISTRA Age of Disasters, or simply the word hashtag polycrisis, about which you will hear a lot more shortly from all the speakers. I think the only good thing to say about the looming world crisis we're facing is that sadly it provides the perfect backdrop for the launch of a book about polycrisis and disasters. One journalist summed it up like this: the world still seems normal, can't last. There's a COVID-like quality to the denial. We can't even hear the words of the head of the European Central Bank. And I quote, "We are in for a real shock that is probably beyond what we can imagine at the moment." And so how South Africa navigates the coming crisis. South Africa in an age of disasters, as our title proclaims, is not a theoretical subject. What every speaker has to say today is urgent and of fundamental importance. With that in mind, here's my challenge to you today, or let's rather call it a game, because I hope this will be fun and interesting. As you listen to these speakers, consider which of the concepts and recommendations that you hear you would implement, and in which order you would implement them if you were in charge of South Africa right now. Decide which is the single most important measure to take today, Tuesday, the 31st of March, for South Africa's disaster preparedness. And after the speakers have spoken, and before our general discussion, I'll ask you to turn to your neighbor and tell them your choice. Or if you're online, I'll ask you to post your choice in the chat. And now it's my great pleasure to hand to someone who always has our country's future in mind. MISTRA's Executive Director, Mr. Joel Nchitenze, will elaborate on the book and the context we find ourselves in. And he's already crowding me, so I can't tell you all the wonderful things he's done. Okay, I'm going to let you up because
Thank you, Terry. I don't know whether I should take a chance and say Shakinovsky.
perfect.
It's as difficult as stage. Like you, I should thank the hosts first, FES, the editors. Maybe at some point during the course of the discussion, we'll just introduce some of the others, so we know their faces. And all the colleagues for joining us here. Terry has indicated the name of the book, South Africa in the Age of Disaster, Managing Risk and Building Growth. No, I'm checking because at one time we were in the age of disaster. What was the purpose of the book? It was to examine the growing number of overlapping circumstances, which are commonly referred to as a polycrisis. I think Abba will elaborate on that. What are some elements of this polycrisis? Floods, droughts, fires, earthquakes, and so on. These are natural phenomena. But other features of the polycrisis, like structural inequality, social and political polarization, inter and interstate conflict, poorly regulated rapid technological change, are generated by human agency. epidemics and pandemics arguably straddle these two categories: human agency and natural phenomena. And so all these developments are felt in such areas as philosophy and religion, scientific and technological pursuits, as well as political and diplomatic conduct. This volume seeks to examine the multiple fronts on which South Africa has to adjust to and prepare for this age of disaster. Our country and continent at large, unfortunately, are less resilient to polycrisis, making the understanding of disasters and their management a high priority. The authors argue that the interventions can be high level in relation to major disasters, but they can also be around issues that seem mundane, like the supply of potable water. So we need capabilities of prediction, prevention, and mitigation, all of which are thrown into bold relief by this. But confining the discourse to natural sciences is inappropriate. That is why the authors use various case studies to show how disasters expose entrenched inequalities in the provision of services and reinforce the cycle of social inequality. This is in part because research on disasters often overlooks complex matters such as the interplay between gender, age, race, social status, disability, geographic location, and so on. So authors propose a transdisciplinary approach. They argue that social agency in managing the polycrisis can only be optimally leveraged if communities are fully involved and if societal leaders draw on people's knowledge and lived experiences, always inspired by the objective of improving the human condition. Now, a strange question, maybe adding to Terry's one. Are disasters universally and temporally disastrous? The answer is that in some instances, disasters can act as a powerful catalyst for human development. They create opportunities for self-reflection, they can drive innovation, and they can generate profound social reform. Even the human-induced disaster of war can, under certain circumstances, give rise to far-reaching social change. In terms of social dynamics, the legitimacy of sources of knowledge and epistemic authority is fundamental to disaster management and risk reduction. This influences how communities and individuals respond to officialdom before, during, and after the onset of a disaster. So the tension between official knowledge and indigenous or local knowledge is also an area that requires attention. We also have to pay attention to the tension between international dynamics and regional or country contexts. Also important, and there's an interesting chapter in the book of this, philosophical and belief systems also need to be factored into the equation. The book offers policy and other recommendations. And if there's one word I can use to describe it, to describe this beautiful manuscript, it is transdisciplinarity. And as MISTRA, we do hope that this contribution will help to arm decision makers and society at large with the tools to manage current domestic and global challenges. We again wish to thank the researchers, our partner in the Department of Science, Technology and Innovation, and others who support MISTRA's work. Again, you're welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much, Joel. I want to echo his thanks to all who contributed to the book, and name one person here today, Editor Ali Parry, who's sitting over there, for whom MISTRA owes a great debt of gratitude. It's my pleasure now to introduce Professor Mark Swilling from Stellenbosch University. He is a distinguished professor and co-director there at the Center for Sustainability Transitions. He's been a visiting professor at a number of universities, Sheffield, Utrecht, Georgetown, Yale. He holds a number of private sector roles, and he's also a member of the National Planning Commission, and in 2024 was appointed to the board of the National Transmission Company of South Africa. Mark, we understand from social media that you're also the proud author of a forthcoming semi-autobiographical new book, so our congratulations to you for that from all of MISTRA.
Thank you very much. Can I proceed?
Please do.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for this invitation to speak at the launch of this very interesting book. I was given it a bit late, but I have been able to read some of the chapters. And am I clear enough?
Yes.
I have been able to read some of the chapters, which are diverse and interesting. I'm really struck by the title, The Age of Disasters, because the book that I recently published is called The Age of Sustainability. So I have a feeling that we have an interesting dance here between those who see the glass half empty and the glass half full. So I think that's interesting that we have this conversation emerging from the South African context. What I find refreshing and interesting about the book is how do I express it? I think I've always been somewhat amazed by the ability of Americans to write the American story as if it is a global story, and I think that requires of us in the global South to write our story as if it's a global story, and I think that this book does that, and there needs to be more of that. Rather than our colleagues in the global North writing the global narratives and we do case studies, I think we have to contest that and turn it on its head. And I think congratulations, I think you do that. I'm just going to reflect on a couple of themes that were triggered by different parts of the book. Obviously, the first one is a theme that I've written a lot about, which is polycrisis. In other words, my argument is the polycrisis is a condition for the sustainability transition. But I think there's two ways in which the polycrisis is discussed. The first one is the dominant one, what I call the World Economic Forum version, which is that the polycrisis is a multiple set of crises embedded within one another. And that is one of the themes of the book. But there is another way in which polycrisis is used, more, I would say, in academic literature, which is that it's the outcome, it's the emergent outcome, using complexity language. It's the emergent outcome of deeper long wave dynamics, which are historical dynamics, but not just social historical, but also geophysical historical dynamics, which come together in asynchronous ways. There are a number of people who think in long wave terms that have become quite influential, like Carlota Perez, the Venezuelan economist based in Europe. But she looks for single long waves, and there's also that UK journalist, of course, is named for a moment, who also looks for single long waves. I think what we need to accept is that long waves, there are a multiplicity of long waves that interact and intersect with one another in asynchronous ways. So I'll just refer to two that I think are significant. One is as a result of my nearly 20-year involvement with the UN's International Resource Panel, which looks at global resource flows rather than biodiversity or climate science, which are the other expert panels. And the socio-metabolic perspective essentially looks at very long wave transitions, the transition to agricultural production 13,000 years ago, the industrial transition 250 years ago, both of which were major switches in the resources that humans use to run their economies and societies. And the argument is, if it's happened before, it can happen again, hence the sustainability transition, which is a shift away from the resources that we've used during the industrial era, in particular fossil fuels. That conception of very long wave socio-metabolic transitions sits uneasily with the Carlota Perez view, which is really only focused on the industrial era and looks at 5 long waves during the industrial era, all of which are essentially the rise and fall of clusters of technologies which become drivers of industrial transformation. For example, the coming together of the steam engine and the printing press, which creates the basis for mass education for the industrialization era, or the coming together of the combustion engine with long-distance telephony and alternating current, which provides the basis for the post-Second World War boom, etc. And she identifies 5 industrial long waves during the industrial era, each one characterized by a midpoint, which is a financial crisis. So there's overinvestment in clusters of technologies. The share values massively escalate above the real value, which is exactly what we're seeing in AI today, and then it bursts. And that bubble burst results in state intervention to reorganize society to absorb the new technologies. And so that when you bring that together with the socio-metabolic transition, then you think to yourself, well, we've had a couple of financial crises in recent years at a point when there is a major crisis of the industrial civilization, coupled with the rise of new technologies, new communication technologies, new transport technologies, and new energy technologies. And it's always that combination of new technologies in those 3 sectors that drives a transition. So I think we need to think of the polycrisis as, in more static terms, as this embedded multiple crises, but also in much more dynamic terms as part of the unfolding of a multiplicity of asynchronous long waves. And I've just given 2 examples of how that helps to understand the current moment. Obviously, conjunctures matter. So we're in a very weird conjuncture where the biggest oil installations in the world are about to get destroyed by the biggest consumer of oil. That might mean Trump goes down in history as the person who accelerated the energy transition, which is really rather weird. But I mean, it is a conjuncture, especially if the oil prices go up, that could hasten quite a lot of deeper underlying dynamics. The second point, the second point I would make about the polycrisis is today I think of the polycrisis in terms of three intersecting crises. So it's not just embedded, but the intersections between ecocide, which is emphasized in the introduction to the book. But ecocide sits alongside in also in asynchronous ways with genocide, and you only referred to genocide towards the end of the book, and femicide. So ecocide, genocide, and femicide are continuously interacting with one another. And I think we need to pay a little bit more attention to how that plays out, especially in our own context, and in the context of what's happening in Sudan and Gaza, and so on. The third point that I would make is about climate change, which is a big theme in the book. And quite often the discussion about climate change leads to a description of where we are in global history in terms of the Anthropocene. And I'm very, very, very concerned about this notion of the Anthropocene, the notion that all of us humans have become a geophysical force of history. Is it really all of us or some of us? And you know, the evidence really doesn't stack up that we're all equally responsible for climate change, for obvious reasons. But one of the, you know, if you read the recent IPCC reports, there is pretty much a scientific consensus that we're going to miss the 1.5 degree warming target agreed in Paris. Or not target, but constraint that was agreed in Paris, and what that raises for me, especially in the context of the science, which shows that the actions of a relatively small number of companies and a relatively small class of overconsumers in the world, who are responsible for the consumption of 86% of the world's resources. One of the consequences of that is runaway global warming, which in turn conjures up the possibility of the post-Anthropocene. And the post-Anthropocene, if the Anthropocene is about humans are in control of geophysical history, then the post-Anthropocene is where humans lose control. And, you know, James Lovelock wrote his famous book called The Revenge of Gaia, which is essentially this image that beyond a certain point of damage to the ecosystems we depend on, they take their revenge on us. And in 50 years' time, according to Lovelock, but many other scientists, there's a massive population reset from nearly 10 billion to what Lovelock projects as the carrying capacity of the Earth as 2 billion. So I think that needs to be related to the impact on South Africa. And I recently coordinated a big research project on the water, energy, food nexus for the SA Tide Initiative, which is the National Treasury's research arm, which working in partnership with the National Planning Commission. And we didn't just look at the financial investment requirements to achieve our infrastructure goals, water, energy, and food, and digital infrastructure. But we also looked at all of that in the context of climate change. And Francois Engelbrecht from the WITS Global Change Institute did the work, the modeling work on projecting climate change impacts into the future using recent IPCC reports. And what his work shows is that if there is what scientists call low mitigation scenarios, in other words, the whole of the world just doesn't care about doing anything about climate change, over the next 20 years, we face a drier future, obviously, more fires, more and longer heat waves, and more multi-year droughts. But what is significant about what the argument that he makes in his paper, which is now published on the SATide website, is prolonged duration of multi-year droughts and heat waves could very well lead to three very disastrous consequences. One is the collapse of the maize crop. The second is the collapse of the cattle industry and more day zero events for towns and cities. And the East is interesting, which is that the eastern part of the country needs to prepare for more floods, but also more droughts at the same time. And then the fourth theme I want to pick up, which is pretty much inspired by the third chapter in the book, which is about seismic shifts. What I like about this chapter is that it talks about seismic shifts, which are geophysical shifts that directly affect us humans, but we don't necessarily control them. And to some extent, there's some similarities to climate change, which is even if we did make the big decisions now, there's a lag effect of a generation. So what I like about the chapter is it sets up an interesting dialogue and dance between the scientific instruments we use today to assess seismic shifts, which are very sophisticated, obviously technologically advanced instruments, and the knowledge that was used traditionally. And there was this fascinating discussion of in Kanyamba, the legendary serpent that is a force of nature, and can change the dynamics. And what this raises for me is, what do we as Africans regard as knowledge? Are we just moderns and we look down on traditional knowledge and associate it with myth and folklore, which is what one is trained to do in the modern scientific paradigm? But there's a different way of understanding knowledge, which is to understand knowledge as context-specific ways in which we understand our world and give it meaning. So it depends on what we mean by knowledge. And Yuri Harari, in his famous book *Sapiens*, popularized the notion that what is distinctive about us is that we live in imaginary worlds, and we cooperate in large numbers, the so-called mass society. And when you bring those two together, we live in imaginary worlds about the nature of our mass society, and our settlement in large groups, if you like. And if that is true, then whether it is seismic instruments or in Kanyamba, both of them are how we imagine the world we live in and give it meaning and help to understand how we need to organize ourselves. And when those concepts start to become redundant because they don't quite fit reality, we shift and we change. And so there's this famous statement in sustainability science that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. The Stone Age ended because we found a better way. We shifted our conception of what is possible and our understanding of the world. And this relates to my fifth point that I want to raise, which is about the notion of ukama. Ubuntu is well known in the Southern African narratives, which is essentially the relationships between us. We are, I am because we are, or we are because we are together, but it's been extended by a lot of writing in sub-Saharan Africa by sub-Saharan philosophers and ethicists to include the notion, to extend it out into the notion of ukama. Ukama is a Shona word that means relatedness, but it's come to mean relatedness that goes beyond traditional Western conceptions of environmental ethics. It includes animate and inanimate objects. So it includes mountains and rocks that have a sacred meaning. But through the ancestors, there's a relationship between the past and the present and the future. Ancestors are from the past, they're in the present, and they help make sense of the future. And so there's an argument in the African literature that Ukamian thinking about relatedness, not just to each other, but to our environment, but also past, present, and future, just creates a completely new way, but very old. There's one editor of a book on all of this who talks about the vindicationists. The African writers are saying the West is caught up with relational thinking. But I think this goes to a very important point at the center of this whole discussion about the polycrisis, the climate crisis, disasters, our futures, which is one of the classic claims, in particular in Western philosophy, which comes from Descartes, which is I think, therefore I am. The African response, or the Ukamian African response to I think, therefore I am, is, oh yeah, and who did you think with? And where you do your thinking? So in other words, who did you think with is immediately saying, well, I don't really care what you think you are. I'm only interested if I know what you think you are in conversation with others. And similarly, context matters. In other words, it matters where you said it and with whom in order to construct a self-definition of identity. But that becomes an important basis for agency. And there's a lot of literature emerging in many different parts of the world, especially in the global south, about relatedness. But interestingly enough, it almost excludes the African discussion. And so we really need to bring it to the fore. And you can't really separate the persistence of Ukamian thinking in the African context from the geophysical context. Africa evolved along the longitudes, multiple climate conditions rather than on the latitude, which the Eurasia developed. And when you're in stable climates, your evolution takes place in a very different way. So then the sixth point that I want to raise is about risk. So there's a whole interesting discussion in Abba's paper, but in other parts about various ways of thinking about the future, scenarios, uncertainty, coping with complexity, etc. And in many ways, it conjures up for me a discussion about risk and risk analysis. And like Joel, I used to sit on the board of the DBSA, and I used to get very, very uneasy when the risk analyst delivers a report on an investment. And essentially, risk analysts are trained in a way of thinking that was originated in the work of Frank Knight, who published a book in 1921. And Frank Knight put down the proposition that we need to make a distinction between risk that is measurable and uncertainty. Uncertainty is about risk that can't be measured and therefore is not part of risk analysis. So we excluded for a century uncertainty from risk analysis because of an obsession and a determination to assess risk in quantitative terms. And that gives rise to the famous formula that all risk analysts are trained in, which is probability times consequences equals risk. And that has been fundamentally critiqued. So Ulrich Beck and a whole tradition of writers in the context of late capitalism have said, no, that you can't quantify risk. And so what has happened in the last 2 decades is the rise of an acceptance of what John Maynard Keynes originally referred to as uncertainty, namely that this is a set of dynamics that quantitative risk analysis can't actually understand. And in fact, what has now happened to, if you like, advanced risk analysis or risk thinking, and it's captured in the multiplicity of instruments that Abba refers to and others, is in the end, risk is really about navigating uncertainty rather than managing risk understood as probability times consequences. And so in the context of that, as Roberto Poli from Italy has argued, the past, he's a futurist, the past is becoming less useful to us. And what we need to focus on is the evolutionary potential of the present. So that doesn't mean, what he means is acknowledge there's a thick present with seeds of and glimpses of the future that need to be emphasized, rather than traditional approaches to futuring where there's a deep impatience with the present. The present is seen as a burning platform between the past and the future, and you just have to get off as quickly as possible. So you sit in front of flip charts, imagining futures as a kind of therapy. But you know, looking closely and deeply at the present to understand the dynamics of what's unfolding is what he's talking about, the evolutionary potential of the present. Then to end off, South African context. What I find interesting about the South African context in this discussion of the age of disaster, the age of sustainability, is maybe we sit at that intersection point between the two, given the fact that we experienced many of these crises. And it's therefore unsurprising that the notion of a just transition actually came out of the South African context. It's referred to in Chapter 5 of the National Planning Commission, National Development Plan. We were the first country in the world to include just transition in our nationally determined contribution, NDC. We included the just transition in our REAP program, and I've just completed a lot of work on auctions as a way of procuring renewables around the world. And we were the first, really, to include a just transition in our REAP program, our auction program. And we were the first to publish a JET implementation plan, now in the global narrative referred to as country platforms. So I think that the fact that the narrative of a just transition, which is now in virtually all NDCs around the world, and also now at the center of a lot of country platforms, it emerges from South Africa as this because of our intersection between deep inequality and our vulnerability from a climate change point of view. And then a last just critical comment, reflecting on more recent work that I've done, influenced by my time on the DBSA, is in South Africa, we are not going to solve our problems in South Africa if we don't change the way we allocate capital. A strong theme in the book is about the role of the state in planning. There's not enough, in my view, in not just this book, but many a lot of South African work about the allocation of capital. Who makes the decisions? Where are the pools of capital in South Africa? We can't just focus on the national budget as a source of funding for our energy transition, because it's not enough. And we have a very conservative Reserve Bank governor who's not going to be printing money anytime soon. So if we're not raising taxes and we're not increasing debt in order to increase spending, and if we're not printing money, where's the capital going to come from? And if we don't understand the South African system as a complex South African financial system, as a web of interlocking balance sheets, in other words, a complex adaptive system, where all these balance sheets interact with one another and in the process result in a flow of capital which tends to reinforce inequality and underinvest in gross fixed capital formation, in other words, fixed assets, we're not going to solve our problem. So we have to engage with the institutional investors, with the banks, with a whole range of financial investors and the DFIs who are very underfunded to redefine risk, because actually what drives the way in which they think about investment is a very, very narrow conception of risk, going back to Frank Knight, which said, uncertainty is not what we are concerned about. And so as a result, we excluded the biggest risk of all, which is the planet. And now that it's collapsing before our eyes, we give up on risk as a quantitative measure and start thinking about uncertainty. And that's a healthy outcome. So let me leave it at that. Thanks.
thank you so much for such a rich and interesting speech. I confess I was struggling to find the glass half full age of sustainability until you mentioned Trump ushering in an era of transition. So that cheered me up. The other thing I just want to mention about what Mark said, not only as an act of shameless self-promotion, but because I think it is really very relevant to what we're talking about today, which is that Mark, with his usual acuity, put his finger on one of the features of this book, which is that it promotes the research in it as part of a global narrative, and not simply as a case study to a narrative constructed somewhere else in the north. And I think I can say with humility, that is at the heart of all the research and all the publications that MISTRA produces. And the profoundly African question Mark raised about who did you think with and where did you think, once again, is something that MISTRA strives very much to put on the agenda here in South Africa.
That thing is for you, Terry.
Thank you again, Mark. Just a joy to hear what you had to say.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
It's my privilege now to introduce the two editors of this book, Zamanzima Masibuma-Makena and Professor Rasigan Maharaja. Zama is a talented and dear MISTRA colleague who has edited no less than 4 MISTRA books. This is her 5th, so it comes with great experience and expertise behind it. And Rasigan is a very distinguished South African academic, policy advisor, research leader, and thinker. He currently holds several key roles, including Chief Director at the Tshwane University of Technology, elected member of the Academy of Science of South Africa, and Associate Research Fellow at the TELUS Institute in Boston. And he advises many international bodies like the G20. Rasigan and Zama, please come up and share with us about the book.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Zamanzima, as Terry has said, and I'm the senior researcher at MISTRA. So a lot of what I'm going to start by saying has been said already, but I feel like I need to just emphasize some points. So disasters arise from a convergence of interdependent factors, which are deeply rooted in geophysical phenomena, socio-economic dynamics, and human agency. They have been a defining feature of the human experience and human history, at times occurring simultaneously. Historian Stuart Hall describes this phenomenon as a conjuncture, or a period in which varying factors at play in a society intersect to distinctively shape that society. Accordingly, Hall posits that history moves from one conjuncture to another, often driven by a crisis or convergence of tensions in any historical moment. Together, these moments can potentially fuel change, but the direction of the change is not guaranteed. It is therefore important to appreciate the conjuncture that we find ourselves in and make sense of the different ways in which societies can prepare themselves to manage disaster outcomes. The chapters in this book touch on the multifaceted aspects of the human experience of crisis. In this context, the contributing authors offer different perspectives on the diverse and multiple fronts on which South Africa has to adjust to prepare for this age of the crisis. The book aims to understand epoch-making disasters and how humans encounter and overcome the impacts of such disasters, considering a range of factors. Through its diverse collection of chapters, the book presents key focus areas and arguments, exploring both recent and historical disasters, while also extracting useful lessons for South Africa from these events. In addition, the book examines how the quality of disaster management is a key contributor to whether a society recovers and thrives or deteriorates in the aftermath of a disaster. Importantly, too, the book illustrates how disaster preparedness takes various forms. It can involve high-level initiatives that tackle major disasters, such as earthquakes, floods, wars, and epidemics. But it can also be concerned with addressing seemingly mundane but critical issues, such as water shortages. Regardless of the nature and intensity of these events, it is crucial to recognize and truly understand how people make sense of disasters and how this sense-making informs their actions in the post-disaster period. I hope you can see that. So the book structure looks like this. And no single volume can cover the vast range of human experiences of disasters that have occurred throughout the ages. The authors of this book can offer only selected fragments of experiences and glimpses of different frameworks and solutions used for the purposes of disaster preparedness and management. Nevertheless, the chapters cover weighty issues with a strong focus on understanding the current age of disasters, including their implications for social activism and contemporary capabilities of prediction, prevention, and mitigation, as well as the impact of disasters on social equity and scientific knowledge. The book has 12 chapters, including the introduction and conclusion chapters, and is divided into 3 sections, as you have seen. Despite the diversity of topics covered in the book, certain themes and patterns emerge consistently. And I will walk you through 6 of the most important ones and resulting recommendations. It is hoped that they will act as strategic starting points for further exploration of and policy formulation around how South Africa can best navigate a new age of the polycrisis. The first theme that arises is the importance of foresight, disaster preparedness, and response planning in times of uncertainty. The state of the available resources, capabilities, governance, mindsets, and capacity to organize, whether at individual, community, societal, or government level, prior to a crisis plays a major role in how the crisis plays out. In this age of disasters, proactive planning, training, and organizing of resources to effectively anticipate, respond to, and recover from emergencies is crucial. Hazards often strike abruptly, and the actions taken both prior to and in the immediate aftermath of an emergency will determine the severity of its impact. Contributing authors emphasize that preparedness is not only synonymous important it is to identify specific
Thank goodness.
They assert that this action needs to be coupled with setting up reliable communication protocols, including how information will be disseminated and how different agencies will coordinate their efforts when a disaster strikes. Early warning systems, which are frequently discussed in the book, constitute another crucial aspect of foresight and disaster preparedness. These systems prioritize human needs by forecasting and monitoring hazards and deploying timely alerts to enable swift action. Moreover, early warning systems can save lives and reduce economic losses resulting from disasters by systematically collecting data and conducting risk assessments to reveal vulnerabilities. These systems have varied features, including the use of technology such as AI, big data, and satellite remote sensing. to track hazards and issue accurate, timely, and actionable forecasts. The use of clear, accessible, and trusted channels like radio, reputable social media accounts, community networks, and direct mobile phone messages to transmit alerts to those at risk. Local government structures have been shown to be central to disaster risk reduction and preparedness in South Africa, acting as the primary frontline responders to emergencies. Local government structures are crucial for implementing risk-informed urban planning initiatives and fostering community resilience. Key roles include localizing risk assessments, managing infrastructure, and coordinating community awareness and evacuation plans. The book demonstrates how political instability, social inequality, corruption, and poor service delivery, most of which are typically associated with local government, result in the failure of essential sectors and the perpetuation of the water crisis, which manifests as poor quality and insufficient quantities of water resources. It is therefore critical that local governments are not only equipped with the required capabilities and resources, but also that their performance is continuously monitored and improved. The second theme is the technology and skills required for disaster management and risk reduction. In the book, the importance of technology for disaster management and risk reduction is highlighted. Several authors stress the urgent need for the development of additional technology tools to facilitate disaster management strategies. As discussed earlier, these tools, ranging from AI-powered predictive models to remote satellite sensing methodologies, are essential for identifying, monitoring, and mitigating the impacts of natural and human-made hazards. Technological advancements have made possible increased near real-time monitoring of climate-related hazards and the relaying of visual images and maps to support the work of emergency services. We'll hear more on this from authors present here. Technology is also important when crises result in severe movement restrictions, such as with the COVID-19 lockdowns. Authors articulate how the rapid expansion of digital infrastructure, online systems for floods is dependent on availability and frequency, all of which enable vulnerability assessments and the identification of risks. Therefore, core elements of capacity building for disaster preparedness in South Africa should be affordable, high-quality internet access, high-resolution remote sensing data, and improved information and communication technology infrastructure. However, technology is most effective in disaster strategies when highly skilled disaster management professionals engage closely with high-tech tools. This integration of modern technology and skilled professionals constitutes a critical, data-driven, and proactive approach to disaster management and risk reduction. And of course, funding will be needed to obtain the right skills and to develop and acquire advanced technologies. The third theme is cycles of vulnerability that reinforce inequality. It comes through strongly in the book that the impacts of disasters are always more severe for poor and vulnerable communities, and that disasters reinforce cycles of poverty, precarity, and vulnerability. A major implication of an age of disasters is that existing inequalities, poverty cycles, and injustices will be further entrenched. Ultimately, because disasters disproportionately affect marginalized and at-risk populations, They spur further economic and health inequalities, thus intensifying the vulnerability of the already precarious groups. The growing number of disasters and their simultaneous occurrences make this group's situation even more precarious, including in relatively well-resourced countries. It is therefore essential for disaster preparedness initiatives to take special cognizance of poor and vulnerable communities. The fourth theme is the importance of transdisciplinary, calibrated approaches to disaster response. Although it has been noted that disasters have the most profound impact on marginalized populations, the authors of the book expand on this argument by showing how vulnerability to disasters is not uniform among those who are already at greater risk than others. Research on disasters often overlooks the complex interplay between the vulnerabilities of communities and individuals, as well as factors like gender, age, ethnicity, disability, socioeconomic status, and geographical location. In South Africa, current policies, which often reveal an insufficient appreciation of historical experiences, do not align with current contexts. This applies to disaster management policies too, with disaster responses regularly based on research data that does not take relevant backgrounds into account. Authors therefore call for an intersectional lens and innovative analytics to be used to identify the nuanced consequences of disasters. The authors suggest that this can lead to a better calibrated understanding of how various factors intersect to influence disaster risk, coping mechanisms, and recovery outcomes. Intersectional approaches also build resilience by recognizing the interplay of cross-cutting and multidisciplinary factors such as risk perception, social mobilization, access to knowledge, communication networks, and gender relations. A lack of an intersectional approach has led to the use of interventions that seemingly assisted in the aftermath of a disaster, but essentially excluded certain groups. For example, authors discuss how in 2020, the South African government introduced the Temporary Employer-Employee Relief Scheme and the Special COVID-19 Social Relief of Distress Grant, alongside top-ups to existing grants. These measures mitigated against some of the worst economic shocks, but they also revealed gaps. Women were underrepresented among the beneficiaries, despite bearing a disproportionate burden of job loss and care work. And eligibility rules often penalized those already receiving child support. Information on the specific parameters of an individual's existence must thus be taken into consideration for tailored government assistance. It is thus of fundamental importance to adopt an intersectional approach which will encourage targeted and nuanced interventions aimed at ensuring that victims of disasters are not left out of disaster recovery initiatives. Again, we'll hear more about this just shortly. The fifth theme is the epistemic authority and disaster management. The emphasis on the importance of transdisciplinary approaches is born of authors' varied investigations into who is considered a legitimate source of knowledge and truth when preparing for, responding to, and recovering from disasters. Epistemic authority influences which information is used as evidence of how to approach disaster management and action. It shapes which risks are prioritized, which warnings are trusted, and how resources are allocated. This often involves tension between scientific or governmental knowledge and indigenous or local knowledge. Frequently, there is also tension between international policies and global South contexts. The commoditization of knowledge thus creates power dynamics which frame disaster responses. Conventional disaster risk management strategies often prioritize scientific data over community-based knowledge. While scientific data is crucial, it can overlook socio-cultural nuances, leading to ineffective top-down responses. During crises like pandemics or unpredictable natural hazards, authorities often have to contend with knowledge gaps, unreliable data, and conflicting expert opinions. Decision-making requires a synthesis of diverse sources, including local insights to bridge these gaps. Authors emphasize that in the current era of accelerating climate change and increasing ecological precarity, it is critically important to invest in and incorporate indigenous and traditional knowledge. The authors also suggest that the exclusion of local research leads to historical analogies and the emulation of international policies that constrain policy imagination. Importantly, too, authors throughout the book assert that communities need to be involved in disaster planning and management. Authors emphasize that any vulnerability and risk assessments, for instance, should draw on communities to provide accurate information from their knowledge and lived experiences. This will help ensure that relief efforts do not fail because of the loss of essential local information. The last theme is disasters, philosophical coping mechanisms, and social progress. Disasters do not only reinforce social inequalities and vulnerabilities, they can also act as powerful catalysts for human development by exposing vulnerability and enforcing improvement in infrastructure, policy, and social cohesion. Disasters can create opportunities to rebuild stronger, test preparedness, and drive innovation in risk management. This often leads to increased political engagement and the strengthening of institutions. This volume contains examples of instances when crises and disasters have led to positive change. One example is on the effect of war on the historical development of societies, which argues that the human-made disaster of war can sometimes result in progressive social change. Authors suggest that war is more likely to encourage progressive social reform if it is a major conflict that represents an existential threat.
That word.
That word. To the existing system. That a high wartime dependence on an excluded group should strengthen reform pressures. That reform is more likely to succeed if there is a pre-existing reform movement, which can take advantage of temporary crisis conditions by engaging in interest articulation and strategic bargaining. That wartime reforms are more likely to stick if they are accompanied by institutional mechanisms or changes in the balance of power that prevent post-war backsliding. Another example is how the COVID-19 pandemic saw the rapid expansion of digital infrastructure, online platforms, and low-cost digital devices. The book also has a chapter that describes how the need to offer consolation during a pandemic can spur the provision of both spiritual and material comforts. Often, people turn to religious scriptures, traditions, and customs to find and give meaning to solace, to determine what their own responses should be, and frequently to allow the disasters to change their own understanding and perceptions of their place in the world. This chapter also outlines how disasters are sometimes interpreted as acts of divine will, tests of faith, punishments for moral failings, or even signs of the end of the world, and how at other times they are seen as opportunities for spiritual growth and communal solidarity. To conclude, reframing disasters is important. The authors of this book have gone a long way towards showing that disasters should not be viewed as purely technical problems. They should also be regarded as social, economic, and political challenges, and that response strategies and interventions should take the lived experiences of affected populations into consideration. It is therefore crucial to address the dominance of global north perspectives in academic and practical disaster management circles, so as to give rightful authority to the knowledge held by those who are affected. This book spans many historical eras and phenomena, from ancient times to the present day, from water shortages and floods to pandemics and earthquakes. The chapters explore several central themes, but as mentioned, they are unable to encompass the enormity of the polycrisis or the scale of disaster risk management and reduction initiatives and outcomes, leaving room for future research. Nonetheless, the value of this volume lies in the fact that certain themes and patterns come through repeatedly across cultures, eras, and disasters. The recommendations identified in this overview of the volume represent some of the fundamental measures and principles required to manage the polycrisis. They point us to the crucial issues to be addressed for South Africa and Africa generally, to build the resilience required to navigate the age of disasters.
So thanks so much to MISTRA and especially to Zama in terms of the presentation as well. Yeah. I'm also aware our time scheduling may be running a little bit awry. Yeah. But I hope this is not the disaster that
As long as it's sustainable.
I've only got 3 or 4 points to add in, and this picks up on. So I'm absolutely grateful to Zama and her leadership in helping us advance the MISTRA for being the custodian of this, because it is a topic that is not so comfortable either. And that's something I think we need to increasingly come to grasp. These uncomfortable topics are the topics that demand our engagement, not to be shifted aside. And as Zama comes towards the end of the presentation, you know, there's a point that's being made about inequality, inequities, and where we are currently. So very much as we are all the products of combined and uneven development, the polycrises themselves are not even. And this is something, again, that forces us to think much more deeply about it. An earthquake is not just an earthquake. Yeah. Depends where you are relative to the earth moving. But we're all on the same planet. So that interconnectedness is another aspect that we need to increasingly be paying more attention to. If you don't mind, I quote something which often comes up in the classes that we're part of now. This is now on a meme, so please excuse me. It's me in analog organic form trying to express something that I've seen digitally. Hottest day in history. Coolest day with respect to the future. Now let that sink in, people. Because that's the space we are in. And this is where the extent to which we allow ourselves to probe what are the root causes of the catastrophes approaching us that will actually build upon. I like the points Mark is raising itself, but as we often engage about these things as well, sustainability is useful, but resilience is critical. And I hope this point also comes through. Yeah? With our current division of revenue, as all of you know, the larger portion of public resources are spent nationally. But unfortunately, other than me living in Swanepoel, the rest of you don't live there. You live in a local government. Yeah. And that's where really we need to be placing a lot more attention with respect to what this implies for us. Yeah. Our capacities, capabilities, and competences, as the book argues, should really seek to also encourage more attention being paid to anticipation, and we have tools for that. Foresight, futures, scenarios, etc. MISTRA has done a lot. How to understand the resources available to us done useful if someone listens to it. So the component about learning is something we really must do more about. Yeah, it cannot be that people are coming out with diplomas, certificates, even doctoral degrees that have the words that are included in the title of this book, that have no appreciation of our real context and what it means, practically or pragmatically. That means, and make the pun because of who spoke earlier, also, yeah, we need to recraft strategies and tactics for this, but on the basis of knowing more, not knowing less, not quantitative indicators that don't tell us anything other than the aggregate status of stuff. Yeah. So Mark knows this from me as well. The answer for me about the class is it's both, but it's never empty. Nature abhors a vacuum. If you see a natural vacuum, please tell us. Major scientific breakthrough. So in that context, you know, the issues that we need to emphasize also about the future research and research that we must be investing in now. Remember, hottest day, coolest day in terms of the future. Knowledge advances, and I worry about us being left behind. You don't mind a play on the word, being right behind. Yeah. And you know why I'm saying that as well, because the push against these domains of knowledge are coming from those right-wingers and especially the fascism that supports them. Just published last week, we have a chair from the Council of Innovation sitting there as well, was the Science and Technology and Innovation Indicators Report. Again, we lament a point. We are stagnating at the 0.62 level of gross expenditure on research and development. China's figure for 2025 is 2.8%. They spend 2.8% of that massive gross domestic product on researching what the future is going to be and how to deal with the past and the present. Yeah. We're not even a fraction of 1%. That's an African Union target. South Africa's target, by the way, because we're exceptional, is 1.5%. Tells you how much even further we're behind. So while the book, I think, helps us all, we must also use this to mobilize. It cannot be that we underinvest in the necessary investigations that will make us resilient and through that deliver sustainability. So I hope these also help take us into the group discussions.
Thank you so much, Summer and Ruskin, for distilling so many of the themes in the book and whetting everybody's appetite for reading and buying it. I'm going to introduce, we now have 4 of the authors of the chapters with us today to talk about their chapters. I'll introduce them very, very briefly. Before I do so, I just want to say that my instructions about the timing is something of a poison chalice. I've been told to be strict but not rude. So, I'm going to ask you, please, we are running a little over time, so I'm going to ask you, please, speakers, to stick to your allocated 10 minutes. And if you see me starting to hover, that's me trying to fulfill my mandate of reminding you to move on without me. Our next speaker is Dr. Yaqub Abba Omar, who is Director of Operations at MISTRA, a distinguished academic and diplomat. I'm going to focus on one aspect of his career now, which is that he devised and taught the risks and scenarios model at Wits Governance and at the Nelson Mandela University. And I want to say that Abba, more than anybody else, has made the art of the scenarios into an expert skill. And I really truly thought of you, Abba, when Mark was talking about, well, firstly talking about imagining futures as therapy, but when he was talking about using the present as our guide to the future, and the scenarios that Abba has developed and refines do that so expertly. His chapter is titled, Are We in the Midst of a Polycrisis? Ways of Understanding the Moment Humanity Finds Itself in. So if you've been hearing the term polycrisis bandied about and wondering what it is, Abba will explain. Abba, over to you. No pressure.
Okay, so
while Mark was talking, I thought, oh, wow, do I need to say anything after that? But as you can imagine, it has really been engaging Mark and his work for quite a while, because we serve on the National Planning Commission. I'm always in awe of the kind of stuff that comes out. It's such a creative, innovative thinker. So I was very glad we could get him to open this. So he kind of touched on, obviously he had to touch a lot of the issues. So I'm going to also run through this very quickly. I think what he indicated was the notion of crisis has a long history. So, people arrive at polycrisis and kind of think, oh, well, something new. He spoke about long wave theory. And I have to admit that a lot of this kind of thinking is from the Marxist background and so Competence was a Marxist, and his approach was very much a Marxist approach to looking at long economic cycles. But Swilling made the important point that very much focus on economic logics and neglects regional specificities. I think that's really critical. And as you saw from his input as well, he compliments us for looking at the whole thing from our perspective. Then there's an organic crisis. Yay, Antonio Gramsci. So I think you have come across more of this kind of his writing about the simultaneous crisis of economics, politics, society, and ideology, and that creates a crisis of hegemony. So many of us were brought up in the 70s, 80s, trying to understand the crisis South Africa faces and what role the liberation movements can play. Ama, who's one of the guys I've been noticing recently, I'm not sure once again if you've come across it, interesting stuff that is coming out, looking at those kind of notions and saying this is what it means for us today. So he says that the organic crisis is a moment of reconstruction and potential new hegemonic formation. And so I think the kind of points that Mark made, and I think Zama and you're summing up also, talking about what exists before the crisis that can be sustained and take us forward. And it's almost like that half full kind of perspective we need, that the world is in shit now and it's getting deeper in shit. But there have been some interesting things happening before the world reaches this point. And we can hope as we come across out of this conjuncture that, so I'm not going to go into other terms that the chapter uses, like permacrisis, perfect storm, mega crisis, etc., overlapping emergencies, meta crisis. I mean, these are all obviously useful terms, but I really want us to focus on this part. There we go, right. So there were a lot of terms like, again, more recent terms. We looked at VUCA. We spoke about 9 planetary boundaries within which humanity can safely operate. And this is quite an interesting way of looking at things. And so the Rockstrom and all, when you say et al., you usually think 2 or 3 authors. There's like 10, 15 authors. So I have to keep cutting it out. Ali Perry, you may have noticed, referring to all the authors in this article. So they work at the Stockholm Resilience Center, and they confirm that 6 of these 9 boundaries have been transgressed. So they're kind of collapsing into each other. Systemic risk, and I'm mentioning some of these terms because that helps build towards the polycrisis. Systemic risks describe the probability of breakdown across an entire system. Then the UN Secretary General kind of highlighted in 2023 that the world is going through key transitions such as the issues of food systems, energy crisis, affordability, digital connectivity, education, jobs and social protection, and climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And he said there are four positive forces that are emerging that we need to look at. Social movements, very important. And I think, we've seen in country-specific sort of thing, and also in global issues, that there are critical social movements coming in. You said, look at Bangladesh, Nepal, it's 2 recent examples, Sri Lanka. Political momentum between social movements and economic momentum, and then technological momentum, are the kind of things that he highlighted. Okay, then So polycrisis and its detractors. So the first of explicit use is most people in modern current, but as I said, a lot of it was based on previous thinking and very much that relatedness in thinking. Where did it come before? Who were you in conversation with even before you started writing? So he wrote in Homeland Earth. Now, Adam Tooze has obviously been a very contemporary, youngish, anyone younger than me, I call him young, youngish writer, presenter. And he's been talking a lot about the polycrisis and said they are disparate, the shocks that are disparate interact. Then other features, they're simultaneously with interaction, so multiple major systems approaching thresholds, slipping into negative territory, but at the same time, they interact in ways that amplify one another. So these are important things that we need to keep about this thinking about the polycrisis. Then there's a notion of cascading effects that crossing one threshold changes the likelihood of crossing others. We're therefore concerned with the realization of cascading chains of events, not merely the potential for harm. And then there's no single cause, no single fix. So I think that's a pretty straightforward thing. And then we'll come to some of its polycrisis and its detractors. So other features are emergent properties. So the damage caused produces a whole lot of exceeds what any one crisis could produce. So you can't like just have one solution, as the previous point made. And they're cross scale. So micro, medium, meso, regional, global, and they affect each other in incredibly unpredictable ways. And it's difficult to comprehend it. And this is where we're going to come with the scenarios kind of thinking that's important. And speak of a need for new language. So quite often people say, we don't have the language for what we experience today. And it's true, there's so many things that we need to be dealing with at the same time. But, Subramanian argued that we've never had more clarity about humanity's threats, and that the real crisis is social paralysis rather than analytical failure, that we're not doing anything about these things. And I can never pronounce this name, but polycrisis and overlapping emergencies serve to depoliticize the moment by obscuring the role of capitalist relations as the underlying culprit. And it was interesting when we were in the first round of the Indra-Miti scenarios, we wanted to interview a whole lot of groupings with this draft scenarios. We went to the EFF and said, this is what capital does. Whenever they're in crisis, they want to draft scenarios. So I think in a sense, this is what he's capturing the thinking. So let's very quickly look at the available tools. We've spoken about scenario planning. And I think as Rasigan has also emphasized, we've been doing as MISTRA a lot of work around that. And it, as I said, it helps imagine. It helps look beyond the horizon, beyond the immediate and that kind of thing. So we can have a whole workshop on that. Hey, naive. And then there's the whole notion of adaptive governance. Now, this is a really tricky one because it's kind of easy, you know, as Russell was saying, PhDs are being written about it, etc., famously by Annette Kriesel. And so it's a framework for managing resilience in complex socio-ecological systems. Now, it tries to look at where the centers are that need to be managed for this change and how that can happen. So it's saying you can't just rely on a central state, things could happen in different ways. So they emphasize active participation and deliberation by diverse stakeholders. So even a local issue like water it can't be resolved at a local level, nor can it happen at a national level. Not only the Water Affairs Department, it's a police and crime issue as well, etc. So we need to have participation, mechanisms of accountability, flexibility to adjust as conditions change. I'm not going to go into some of the things, but there's a part to this as well. There are challenges. So, you know, we get caught up with the legal and institutional arrangement. So this is the responsibility of Water Affairs Department. In fact, I learned at some point that if the water is on the ground, it's water affairs, and if it rises to the skies, it's environmental affairs. So whose responsibility is which? So this kind of thinking obviously needs a level of flexibility. And then moments of crisis are windows of opportunity. And again, that half full kind of thing. And even then, entrenched interest can block emerging new arrangement. Then there's robust decision making, which is another favorite of mine, and I won't go too long into that before you become rude. It was an important one. Rachel Meadows brought it about with the Club of Rome adoption, and then it's associated with the RAND Corporation methodology, etc. But it's obviously been important in looking at the response to the climate crisis. So again, I'm not going to go into that. So what they say is that they try to look at strategies that perform acceptably is an important thing for them. And last slide. And this was the Summit of the Future. And this I actually appreciate. It was a good collective effort, this whole book as well. And I really enjoyed the author meeting where people say, why don't you look at the Summit of the Future as a response to the polycrisis? And this is where I think there is hope, this kind of reform that happens before the kind of crisis. So this was called up by the United Nations, especially South Africa, Germany, etc., pushing for this kind of summit. And it's a pact with the youth, etc., etc. So there's a number of things, I won't go into the details of what it came up with, but all the good stuff is there. But big challenges. Number one, big one, Trump, but just generally the geopolitical challenges. Then again, people complain the language is vague. The very people that complain the language vague are the very people that made the language vague because they couldn't compromise. And the global south pushes something in the north, and then the European found that it's too vague. Then there's financing gaps. As you know, who's committing to these kind of things about the future, investing into the future? Structural inequalities, so civil society said it doesn't address that, it's not going to change it. And then the big one is implementation gap. And with that,
Thank you, Abba, for covering so much and such interesting concepts. Our next speaker is Miriam Hofisi. She is a researcher and academic associated with Northwest University, and her research is focused largely on financial inclusion, digital economy, and development studies. The chapter written by her and her colleagues is titled An Intersectional Approach to Natural Disasters in Southern Africa, Utilizing Big Data and Artificial Intelligence. And I can tell you it's such an interesting and important way of looking at a term much bandied about at the moment, artificial intelligence. But it's one of the few instances of seeing it, of translating into how it's applied on the ground and how it can be useful to us and the big data that surrounds it and the ethical and practical and political issues. Over to you, Miriam, to tell us more about the chapter. Just be mindful of the time and the human timekeeper here.
Well, as researchers, I would want to ask, how do we stop artificial intelligence from regarding disasters as just data sports to hotspot or to shed light onto how people are affected by disasters, why, and also who is the hardest hit? I would want to believe that if intersectionality lenses are applied or they meet with algorithms, they'll be able to tell a wholesome story of the impact of disaster. Good morning, my name is Miriam Hofisi. I'm from Northwest University. I don't need to introduce myself further than this. Okay. So I would want to talk about the concepts that frame disaster in South Africa or in Southern Africa in general. So I just wanted to go back to the basics and look at what hazard is. So according to UNDRR, it's a phenomenon that may actually cause adverse effects as listed here. And disaster now is a serious disruption, is defined by World Health Organization, of that actually requires outside assistance to be resilient or to actually recover. And then the most important concept that I want to shed light on is vulnerability. That vulnerability is a social construct. It's not something that is natural or occurring. And that brings me to my most important model, which is intersectionality. So intersectionality as it was described or as it was propounded by Kimberly Crenshaw. She said that it's a state of being whereby a number of intersecting identities can actually compound to create pockets of marginalization or privilege. In the South African context, we can talk about the apartheid geospatial engineering and how, for example, a woman who lives far from the centers of economy can actually find it difficult or can actually be more vulnerable than others. So in short, I can say this is what motivated me to look at how intersectionality can actually be instrumental in studying disasters. So if we are to look at intersectionality in Africa in general, in Southern Africa, you find that they are already, we can scale down or scale it up the intersectionality lenses to look at the vulnerabilities that are already inherent in Africa. Given that the increasing temperatures that are rising in Africa and how Africa is actually grossly affected by disasters more than other regions, actually continents in the world. And then this is compounded by the factors that I've listed here to say limited investment in disaster risk management, owing to the fact that most of African countries, they grapple with limited or constrained budgets. Although they are signatories to the Sendai framework, or they've even tailored the African program of action to kind of tailor or to scale down the Sendai framework to the African realities. Also, institutional and political barriers are factors. And then also, it is notable that most of African countries actually have to go and take from the national budgets to intervene in cases of disasters. As a result, you find that most of the time disaster management systems in Africa are more of reactive than proactive, which brings us to this statement that I made to say it is compelling for African governments to actually think of or to tap into intersectionality, not necessarily to replace the government, but to actually come up with a cost-effective way of dealing with disaster and the management of it. So why intersectionality and artificial intelligence? It's notable that machine learning is proficient in processing data. It has the computational power to produce a complex reality of intersecting vulnerabilities that are otherwise difficult to note if one were to use human beings to assess disasters and their impact. Or an example of such is the ANN and the geographically weighted random forest. It is actually used in Kigali, in Rwanda, and it was very effective in coming up with an index of the socio-economic factors that affect women as well as other victims of disasters. So also machine learning can actually handle multidimensional data sets such as census data, social media, and sensor metrics. And while we are still on census data, machine learning is very important. It's proficient also in bridging data gaps that are actually inherent in informal settlements. And also natural language processing, which makes it more efficient to process information, especially from social media platforms. And it also automates and makes updates quick, especially in face of the need for quick intervention to disasters that happen rapidly. However, we cannot regard artificial intelligence as a holy grail to disaster management. And we cannot ignore some of the issues that are non-artificial intelligence, such as the black box nature of AI, where you feed in information to it, you don't know how the decision-making processes is. And actually, it has been noted that because of this black box nature, sometimes artificial intelligence becomes actually a tool for bias in itself. And also the ethical and privacy concerns, the digital divide, implementation costs for African countries, especially gaps in representation, especially on social media, can actually be mutually reinforcing to vulnerabilities that we are trying to look at. However, because of these factors, we cannot disregard artificial intelligence because across the globe, there is no universal, or there are no laws that we can say that have been established to to actually use artificial intelligence. However, countries such as the United Kingdom, even the regions like the European Union, they are coming up with ways of ethically dealing with artificial intelligence rather than disregarding it. Because artificial intelligence actually has the propensity to be transboundary in the sense that data that is produced in one country can be used by another. An example that I'll give is that one of Japan and Spain in the region of Valencia, where there was a disaster that was there. The regional government did not communicate the impact of the forecast of the disaster, but the Japanese government, because they could access this information, they managed to inform their residents who were in that region, which was effective in forecasting disasters. And also the artificial intelligence is very efficient in forecasting disasters. So when I went on to do my research findings, I noted that in most of the cases, so far, disaster data that is generated on disaster is actually focused, is instrumental in nature in the sense that it focuses on where disaster is happening. But however, it misses some of the most important elements of disaster, and it also cannot inform policy in that way. So some of the issues, like for instance, the Western Cape disaster of 2015-2018, the drought, they managed to use AI to come up with plans such as the Day Zero. However, that data does not mention the adaptive capacities of locations such as informal settlements in the Western Cape. And then the case that, and also geospatial data was used, meaning that governments already have access to artificial intelligence. Although it was important in locating the victims, however, it does not paint a picture of how certain silent or invisible groups were affected and how they were affected. Also across the border, also in Zimbabwe, it is notable that they also use GIS, they use complicated NASA and European agencies data, and also used social media for geotagging. However, although they were able to identify vulnerabilities, especially infrastructural vulnerability, but it also lacked experiences of how people were affected, and therefore it is very difficult to inform interventions that actually are effective. So I actually arrived at this kind of like a conceptual framework to say intersectionality is very important because it explains how overlapping social inequalities exist in terms of disasters. Therefore, and also that artificial intelligence and data governance is very important. Artificial intelligence is actually a tool that is in the hand of government and practitioners that they can actually use and use it effectively to do disaster management, and also to paint a picture and also to address issues of social injustice. For instance, in countries such as South Africa, where the Gini coefficient is so high, it's very important to know the nuanced experiences of certain populations and identities that intersect to cause vulnerability or privilege. Therefore, the conclusions that I came up with is that artificial intersectionality, is very efficient in enhancing vulnerability targeting and resource allocation, meaning that in the face of constrained budgets, intersectionality is actually important in that it can fine-tune and give tailored interventions to disasters, and also that it improves the predictive accuracy of artificial intelligence, and also that it's very important to advance equity and data justice. So the recommendations that I came up with is that it's very important for the South African government to integrate intersectional data collection and analysis in face of disasters, and also to augment capacity building and training, and to strengthen multi-sectoral partnerships, as well as investing in research and innovation, as has been reiterated earlier. So what am I saying? Is that without intersectionality, artificial intelligence enhances efficiency, and that is true. However, if we are to integrate intersectionality to it, it enhances social justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miriam. And you can hear for yourself how, as Zama said, certain themes come through again and again in this book, which is that neither data nor technology can be produced or understood or used or interpreted outside of a context. And that's a theme that comes up very strongly again with our next speaker, Wapula Mashilani's chapter is on satellite remote sensing methodologies for mapping and predicting floods in South Africa, a systematic review. Wapula is a remote sensing scientist at the South African National Space Agency, SANSA. And I have to say that your chapter was both a source of hope and despair about the potential that is offered by technology and the limitations there.
Yes, good morning. As the facilitator has mentioned, I'm Wapula from the South African National Space Agency. So,
What does the name mean?
Wapula. Part of the rain, others say.
Rain, yes.
Yes. Yes, so we look at how to use satellite technologies to assist in disaster quantification and also mitigation. So here we're going to talk a bit more about the actual events that had occurred where satellite imagery was used here in South Africa. For starters now, one thing which we all know is that the flooding incidents in South Africa are very much increasing. Actually, just yesterday, the NDMC declared that they had 19 flood events in South Africa that were declared as a national disaster over the past 5 years. It doesn't mean that we have experienced 19. It's just the 19 that were declared a disaster. So that 19 is a minimum that we have experienced essentially, because there are others that occur in other parts of the world, like Mudimole, like Tabatsimbi, which went unnoticed. They were not reported on mainstream media. You'll just see a clip here and there on social media and so forth. So these flooding disasters, they cost our government a lot of money. And also it cost us a lot of lives. The examples are the two that I've stated there. The KZN flooding, in which 7.4 billion in damages was reported, and 436 people lost their lives. And there are still thousands more that were impacted, but they are somewhere in between. They got impacted, but people didn't necessarily lose their lives then. And also the Eastern Cape flooding that occurred last year, which also cost our government and our societies a lot in terms of money and people. So all this, plus the fact that we've had a minimum of 90 in the past 5 years, indicated that we really need to have some form of mitigation measures that we need to employ to ensure that we can manage the uncertainties and also the risk that comes with the flooding. So my presentation talks very much nicely with the previous speaker's presentation, because now everything happens in the geophysical world. Satellite imagery assesses the geophysical. And then with where the technology is going now, especially with the applications of AI, it goes to a level where we want to develop certain things which we call digital twins. So a digital twin is the digital depiction of the reality on the ground. For example, for you to make an understanding of it, make sense of it. When you live here, you can go onto your phone and say direction from where you are to home, and then it will show you the route, and it will also show you the traffic, right? That is an aspect of digital. So we want to go that route in developing a digital twin, which will give you the information as and when a disaster is occurring. So that when you are sitting at home, near real time, you can be able to say, along this river, this road and this road and this road are currently being flooded. these households here in this Indian area are currently being flooded. So that is what satellite technologies allows us to do. So essentially, that's what this is essentially looking at. So, but to start us, where did we start? We started with doing a systematic review to just see what methodologies are being employed in the world and also comparing that to South Africa. And then we, with our systematic, we noticed that we have okay, we have certain articles that were published here in South Africa and the world. When we look only at the applications of satellite imagery into flooding, we realized that the articles were more. We had more than 7,800 articles, which means that globally that is happening at very much higher rate. But when you come to South Africa, we found that it's only 54. So 54 in the context of over 7,800 means in South Africa, we're still lagging behind, right? And then we go into now machine learning and AI. And then with that, we realized that in South Africa, actually, we only had 3 that looked at application of machine learning and satellite imagery in the mapping and prediction of flood. So this also tells us that we as South Africa, we still have a long way to go in terms of research. And then the results that we get is that with the systematic review is that in terms of remote sensing and flooding, the two topics, the research there in terms of application has been done quite substantially. But when we factor in machine learning, there are certain methodologies in terms of deep learning, in terms of learning systems, neural networks, which they have some level of work which has been done. By the way, this is globally, because in South Africa we only had 3. So we are assessing what happens globally. So in terms of globally, we can see that machine learning systems or methodologies are increasingly being used. As much as the previous speaker did indicate that because it's a black box, some level of error may be coming from the system itself. However, we can also try and account for that by also training and incorporating more and more things. Now, in the discussion, as I already indicated, over 7,800 globally in terms of research, but in South Africa we have 54. And then out of the machine learning, which was 341, in South Africa we only have 3. So in South Africa, we still have a bit of a long way to go. However, the advantage of South Africa is the following. In South Africa, we have had the likes of South African Weather Services for a very long time, which the skill of predicting and weather forecasting is actually very, very, very much at a mature level. However, the predictions often, or the forecasts often are limited to a district level. So they will tell you that this is what's going to happen in Tshwane, this is what's going to happen in Johannesburg. But they will not tell you that this is what is going to happen in Alexandra specifically, right? It will not tell you that along a river in Centurion, these areas and these areas are the ones that often get flooding, or they will most likely get into flood when we say there is a level 10 categorized rainfall that is predicted, right? So this part of this work, that is where it's going. So now I just wanted to show you just a little bit of what we're talking about. Here, this is an example of 2 products, right? One, satellite imagery. With the satellite imagery here, it is showing you the actual households that got flooded during the Eastern Cape flood. Look at it here, this part, you can see the actual individual structures that actually got washed away, which are indicated in red here. And then you have those, the full settlement, which even though the houses got affected, but none of them were washed away. So this is the difference before the flooding, then this is after the flooding. Now coming to other, this product, the blue what you see here, this is where we modeled that in this area of Mthatha. This is the area which will most likely to be flooded if water level rise a particular height above the river bed, right? And then the red that you see is the actual flooding element. So this shows you that even in those rural of the rurals where the municipalities are so poor that they cannot conduct flood lines and tell people that this is a flood line, do not build here, satellite technology can easily just demarcate that for nationally without using too much money or too much computation. Same, this is same product. This is for Durban. This area that you see here is the SAPRAF facility. If you remember, the SAPRAF facility got flooded there during the 2023 flood. So this is just to demonstrate satellite imagery, satellite technologies, AI, and its capability to say, let's leverage these technologies. Let's leverage the technologies. Let's use them more so that they can inform our decision making. It doesn't only end here. If one was to ask, okay, we provide a particular amount of budget towards disasters. Let's say flooding disaster, for example. If one was to ask, from the budget that we allocate, how equitable is it to the risk of flooding that is there? That answer is hardly ever. That question is hardly ever answered. Which means we do what? Right. Yes. So as long as our planning and our allocation of resources is relying on, we are not going.
Thank you.
That's not the science, right?
Thank you so much for that. Just a word of apology to the people online. I understand our network has dropped a few times. Hopefully it is stable now, but apologies for any difficulties you're experiencing. Our last speaker now is Dr. Ferriel Adam, and I think it's safe to say that she embodies what Joel identified as that wonderful word, transdisciplinarity. She is a scientist and an activist, someone who has turned that scientific knowledge into a determination to campaign for water justice, as you can hear from the title of her chapter, which is Finding Water Justice in an Unjust System. And for over 20 years, she's been an environmental justice activist in South Africa, working with Earthlife and Greenpeace, but mostly find toy-toying behind a megaphone. Ferriel, please come and share.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for including me to be part of this process and listening to all the previous speakers, and I'm looking forward to reading the chapters. Of course, my water antenna was going out in terms of AI centers and the amount of water they're going to be using. Oh, yeah. See how this goes. There's no doubt, I think we're all living it, in that South Africa is definitely experiencing a water polycrisis that cannot be attributed to a single driver. It is multi-layered, it's complex, and it's systemic, and it's everything that has been said already. But while a polycrisis can be debilitating, and I'm trying to do the half full, half empty, it's very hard, half dirty as well, can be debilitating and disempowering, it also reveals why solutions cannot be left with one sector alone, and specifically with the state at this point. So my chapter grapples with one aspect of this polycrisis, which is the policy issues and how we live in a country where water is a constitutional right, but millions do not have access to water and sanitation. And I need to say that often I say water when I mean water and sanitation. So this chapter opens in Carolina, in Mpumalanga, where a community has been living with polluted water for more than a decade, I think 15 years now. They experience sewer spills, acid mine drainage, and a treatment plant that does not function have become part of their everyday life. Community took the municipality to court. They won. And more than 10 years later, after that court case, the water is still not safe to drink. But the issue is not whether rights exist. The issue is whether they mean anything in practice. What is the value of a right that is not realized, or a court victory that changes nothing? Carolina is not an exception. It reflects a much broader pattern across the country. So one of the central arguments in this chapter is that South Africa's water crisis is not primarily about scarcity, although it is a big issue, and it is not because we lack policy. In fact, the country has relatively decent, and I want to say decent, legislation, and a clear recognition of water as a human right. The problem lies in governance and implementation. Over time, mismanagement, corruption, political interference weakened our weak institutions, delayed infrastructure development, and there's a complete lack of consequence management and accountability. At the municipal level, where water and sanitation services sit and are supposed to be delivered, many of these systems are struggling with limited capacity, poor maintenance, and in some cases, complete breakdown. Now, I'm standing here, and as we're speaking, national government's releasing the latest blue drop, green drop report, and it is very frightening. So, Mark Swilling, I don't know how we can be half full here on this one. The consequences of this are visible in the numbers, but they are even more visible in people's lived experience. A significant proportion of treated water is lost before it reaches households. We know that. The previous amount we have is 47.4% of our water is lost, right? Through leaks, theft, and failing infrastructure. This is not simply a technical issue. It points to a system that is not being effectively managed. At the same time, water quality is deteriorating. Half of our drinking water systems across the country are not fit for drinking. You can drink in Johannesburg. Every now and again, there's a problem. But you can drink the water in Johannesburg, maybe Tshwane. But the minute you go out of Joburg, Northwest, Free State, Limpopo, Pumela, do not drink the water from the tap. This is the reality of South Africa. Wastewater treatment plants are failing in many parts of the country. At least 70% of our, and by the way, 70% was my previous statistic. I think it's worse now, according to today's report. So wastewater treatment is failing at 70% of our systems are failing, and they're spewing sewage into our rivers and streams. So you've got toxic sludge rivers, and at least 10% of our population rely on those systems. And again, these impacts are not evenly distributed. People with financial resources are able to secure alternatives, whether through bottled water, boreholes, storage systems, or private supply. We're even getting in newly established estates, because municipalities are not doing planning properly. You can get a package plant for wastewater and a package plant for water treatment. That is how exclusive it's becoming. So those without those options are left to rely on what is available, even when it is unsafe. In this way, water quality becomes another site where inequality is reproduced. We had photographs from the Free State in the beginning of this year of bloodworms in tap water. So the same is true when we talk about access. If you look at government's reports and the government's report on SDG, it sounds as if 90% of our people have water and 87% have access to sanitation. It's not true. The official statistics often suggest that access has improved, but those figures do not capture how unreliable many systems are. A communal tap or intermittent supply may be recorded as access, but in practice, it means that people are constantly managing uncertainty, where water tankers are an access, but they don't take into account that elderly women particularly are using their SASSA grants to pay young people to fetch their water for them. When systems fail, households have to adapt, and that burden falls unevenly. It is carried primarily by women, by children, and by people in low-income communities who already have limited resources. These dynamics became very visible during the Cape Town drought. While the crisis affected the whole city, it did not affect everyone the same way, and we're seeing this again in Johannesburg. Higher income households were able to install tanks, drill boreholes, or purchase water. Lower income households, and there was a study that was done that showed that had far fewer options. And from using about 200 maybe liters a month, they had reduced in that day zero to about 180 liters a month, not flushing the toilet in households of about 12. It is also important to be clear about what we mean by scarcity. Yes, we are a water scarce country in terms geographically, but physical scarcity is only one part of the story. How water is allocated, how infrastructure is maintained, and who can actually access water all matter. When large volumes of water are lost through systems, large allocations are still given to the big industries like agriculture and mining. When large volumes of water are lost through systems, the issue is not only how much water exists, but how it is managed. Climate change is that cherry on the top. It's adding another layer of pressure with more frequent droughts and floods. And we talked about all of the data. The UNICEF has said that from 2008 to 2015, 74% of natural disasters was around drought and floods. And with climate change, that is going to be worse. So what emerges from all of this is a system in which access to safe and reliable water and sanitation is still shaped by inequality. Income, geography, infrastructure determine who has consistent access and who does not. That reality sits in direct tension with the idea of water as a universal right. We interviewed elderly women in the south of Joburg in Waterworks. It's an informal settlement where this elderly woman, she's about 70, had a bout of diarrhea. But she had to wonder whether she walks down the street to the toilet at 2 a.m. in the morning or do something else. And she didn't want to tell us what this something else. Because when we talk about water is life and government says sanitation is dignity, it's a lived thing. That is a real thing. It's actually what people are going through. So at the same time, the chapter also points to ways in which communities are responding. It replaces, in places like Carolina, people are not simply waiting for the state to act. They've lost hope. They are organizing, they're testing water, they're documenting contamination, they're challenging municipalities, and they're using their evidence to engage as well. This form of activist citizen science is not only about data collection, it is about shifting power and making it more difficult for institutions to ignore what is happening on the ground. However, this also raises an important concern. Communities are stepping in because the state is failing to meet its obligations. They are taking on roles that substitute government's functioning and accountable public system. And that is what's happening all along South Africa. So the conclusions that emerge are relatively straightforward. This is a governance crisis rooted in institutional failure and a lack of accountability. It is also an inequality crisis because the impacts are not shared equally and tend to fall on those with the least power and resources. And while community action is critical, it raises questions on the role of the state in ensuring equitable access to water. And this is where I think someone talked about bringing business. We cannot be finding solutions using the same thinking and echo chambers. We need to be reflecting on all the sectors that are involved. The case in point is the President's New Water Crisis Committee, which has all the government people and very few, I would say, business people, but nothing of civil society.
Surprise.
South Africa's water crisis is often compared to the energy crisis, but I have to say in many ways it is more immediate and it's worse. In energy, there's easy alternatives. When water systems fail, the effects are felt directly in people's health, their livelihoods, education, and their ability to live with dignity. This is not a distant or abstract issue. It's part of everyday life for millions of people, and we're seeing it. The problem is that there is a gap between what is promised on paper and what is delivered in action. And until that gap is closed, water will continue to function less as a guaranteed right and more as something that is shaped by where you live, what you can afford, and how well the system around you happens to work. And that is the contradiction we have to confront. And I hope comes out in the chapter that in South Africa today, your access to water still depends less on your rights and more on your circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you, Ferial, for reminding us as well that confronting disasters is not just a matter of survival, dignity, and the sanctity of life. Thank you. We turn now to the time for discussion, but before we do so, for those of you who joined late, I invited everybody to consider if they were running South Africa right now, what is the one thing, given everything they've heard, they would do for disaster preparedness. So if you're in the room, I'm going to ask you to turn to your neighbor and share for 30 seconds. If you're online, please post it in the chat. And then Rasigan will lead us in the discussion that follows. What I say. Disaster management. Africa, the age of disaster. Yes, Rasigan, to lead us in the discussion.
Thanks, good colleagues. As you heard, and the solutions sometimes present themselves much easier when we think through them in its wholeness. Right, no, if we had a book to help guide us, it would be useful. Yeah? But at the same time, as we
according to my chapter, we do have books to guide us.
so much we understand. Thanks, Nick.
Quran and the Bible.
So we try to keep the secularity. I promise to do that as well, about other aspects, not in old books, but currently the disasters that we are all experiencing. So earlier on, there were about 90-some people online as well. Zanele is going to also feed in if there are. I want to suggest, because of our timing, this is our real circumstances, not what's promised on the paper that you saw coming. You would realize we don't have an hour for the discussion. We have merely a few minutes. So my suggestion, proposal to you, with respect to this impending disaster, is let's pick up on, please. We encourage those online to submit comments, questions that come in. And I do the same with all of you present here. Let's pull that together, but we are not going to be able to have this in rounds of questions with all the authors. Time doesn't afford that to us. So if that's all right, because I could even get a sense from Terry's provocation, there's a lot that wants to come out. And hopefully the words will suffice for now. So can I ask then, from the room itself, if people have comments and questions, please be encouraged. You can do both. You don't have to be forced into framing a question. Please.
Thank you very much. And I hope Professor Swilling is listening.
Tell him.
Because he was in Perak and I was in Sanko. We were intent on breaking the Group Areas Act and the passports. And we encourage people to move into Johannesburg and other cities, but in Johannesburg in particular, where we were serving. For the moment, if you take the disaster in the Region G of Johannesburg, there's 1.5 million people that have come in the recent past years. That was not planned for, where there was no water, no sewage, and no institution. Now, what is the solution going to be for the state and for everybody else? Is really to look at new cities. We can't actually develop where we are at the moment. And I think those of us who were activists in the past that actually influenced the disaster that is now should actually try and find a different solution.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that. You know, I mean, as you're raising it as well, contextualizing the points you're making adds so much more value as well. People online as well can pick up. So thanks so much for raising it in the forum. I saw a second hand here. No? Sure.
Yeah, no, to start with a confession, it's part of my job at MISTRA. I read all the chapters. And the question that I would want to pose, maybe for the authors, in terms of the policy brief, are you confident, given not just what is contained in the chapters, but what was presented, are you confident that we are adding knowledge and advice to the policy makers that they can easily translate into both policy and action? So if Department of Science and Technology, Environmental Affairs, and others were to read both the book and the policy brief, would there be clear guidelines on what they need to do going forward?
Thanks so much, Joel. All right, so, sorry, Sandy.
Congratulations to the authors. I mean, really interesting books, and I wish we could take some of this and convert it into audios, because I also had to read the book. And a lot of it was science and history in my head, but it's fascinating. But what I want to ask from a kind of social sciences point of view is whether the policy choices around other areas of public life, in particular, the model, I think Abba and even Mark may have referred to it, of economic growth and development, are out of sync with this trajectory that we are on. And if so, from the perspective of scientists, what, and this is the social sciences, I mean, Lawrence Korombo wrote a chapter on war, Naeem one on philosophy and religions and social change. What do we need to do? Because polycrisis is saying, yes, there are these intersecting crises, and they are compounding each other. So how do we still achieve growth? How do we still achieve development if the way in which we seem to have chosen to go about it is in itself potentially disastrous? I'd just like to hear some thoughts on that question. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Sandy. I'm going to come around, so all the authors best be aware. Yes, that this responsibility.
Let us thank all the authors.
So we go around and also give everyone a chance to contribute here. But Sandy's raised something, and if you don't mind, Sandy, push you a little bit further, not just social sciences, but humanities, in terms of being able to even understand the social sciences. Because there's a level of discourse where we are excluding people, not from using terms. I would seriously push us against trying to, what do they say, dumb down the terms. But having terms doesn't mean you cannot communicate it. One would assume if you have a title in front of your name that says you do this in teaching, you know how to communicate it. And if you don't, we need to ask the question, why do we employ them in that function intergenerationally? I'm pushing something quite harsh here. Yeah? And it's not just as to the name of the language. It's how you conduct yourself inside the language itself. And these issues, the gap between indigenous traditional knowledge systems and our world systems today is a major gap. This gap has been foisted, as we heard from Joel, right throughout. How do we redress this? Why? Because we are no longer just global north and global south. We are a world majority that's confronted by actions of a very small minority of the world's population. And sorry, Sandy, this is what impacts, because it affects what the meaning of growth is. So we need to also bring into our discourse, this is growth of what, for whom. And you mentioned quite correctly, Club of Rome. We know how it then impacted on Rand and others. But the current version of the Club of Rome's documents is written mainly by African scholars. And it's seriously breaking through what we had seen in the past by bringing it to the fore. So I hope I've created enough space for all the authors also to frame your responses by raising it here. I'm going to look up, please.
In terms of AI, we seem to be in a catch-22. Because on the one hand, we're saying we can use AI to help us to think ahead about disasters and so on, but at the same time, as Friedel was saying, it impacts. So we're in this catch-22. So I want to know whether we've addressed this in the book. And if not, is there something we can do to think and make that kind of accessible to all of us? Because I think the AI people are still saying, we don't know which way it's going to go. So that's one point of view, but like we don't know if AI is going to grow or not. So yeah, that's my question.
Also a very good point that's been raised. We will pick it up, please.
Okay, my name is Maswele from the SABC. And of course, I haven't read the book. But there's a disaster that has been reported about for the past 2 weeks, stemming from the Strait of Hormuz. And we've been expecting our government since yesterday or the weekend to announce on the price of petrol, diesel, and all that. And now it's less than in 12 hours before the price kicks in, and we still don't have the actual prices. And you took the book or figures speaks about managing risk and building competence, including preparedness. How are we supposed to be prepared for what is coming tomorrow and the prices of food and all that if we still don't know when I'll be able to pour petrol tomorrow and go to work? I wanted to find out from us, including the, let's say, the kind of research that is being produced in South Africa, how much of it gets implemented on the government level? Thank you.
So I'm looking for a soundbite.
Fortunately not.
Colleagues, as you hear that as well, there's also a function for our public broadcaster, besides sending us harassing notes about 340 rand. Really encourage maybe a few about war on Iran that's taking place and its impact upon all of us. A colleague mentioned quite correctly, we saw the picture from Lars Meerbank, Mubeli. Saprif is there. It was flooded. Yeah. We have storage facilities in Saldanha. That's from the apartheid era, preparing for what the oil embargo should have done. Currently, only 2 out of the 6 storage vessels have oil in it. This was from before the disaster that we are now experiencing. SAPREF is not operational. Other countries in Africa are not as prone as us. If you heard my radio show from last week. Dangote's refinery is physically producing petroleum. Nigeria, the biggest country in Africa, has all its fuel produced onshore. No longer waiting for ships from wherever. Why? Because the oil actually comes from there. And now for the first time, we are turning that oil into petroleum at that scale. SAPREF didn't operate at the same scale. Right? They are also sharing petroleum products with 6 of their neighboring countries. The big question, why aren't we part of it? We continue to remain tied in, and these are part of the legacies that we also need to respond much more clearly. The points raised about artificial intelligence good people, I really would encourage, before we use the word artificial, let's re-emphasize the organic element, not just organic crises. But organically, our ability to see reality translated into scientific fact and work on the basis of what's established as fact, not alternative facts that come from the White House. You see, I framed it in that way. We see someone whose job is in KwaZulu-Natal promoting investment, championing the placement of a data center. Yeah, already. Why? Because his KPI, foreign direct investment, gets ticked. It's the very same place that has no water, has no electricity, that's unstable. So we really have to bring a lot of this organically to us. As to the artificial side, you heard from Terry. We couldn't keep the 90 people online all the time. Where is the ubiquitous broadband that some people based a vision of our future South Africa a few years ago? We don't even have that. We have to start with what we actually have, not what normatively we like to have. Yeah. So on that basis, I would really want to encourage, when we write these policy briefs as well, we must know who we're writing it for. Yeah, and I'm sorry, it isn't some, opaque entity with a slot inside that you put something. I've made a bigger point by saying this. Yeah. We must be able to speak to the individuals that carry the responsibility, because it's a mandate that they are holding. It's not about picking up the maps, a good colleague from SANSA from 1972. We have more than a century of geohydrological work that's not been digitized. I checked with the council responsible. They want to see how they can sell products to get money to digitize our archives. Who is going to pay for it? But those predictions from our weather service is a consequence of having that data available to them. If that data series is interrupted, the ability to forecast is reduced. Now, who put that KPI on the Council for Geoscience, where they have to sell a product as it was listed, as opposed to a component of our knowledge system that helps us make better decisions about things? So balancing between that, some of the tension in our science system, as Joel pointed out, yeah, just having something that's scientifically accurate doesn't mean behavior is going to change. We need to confront that. So I want to go through our colleagues as well. Would you be interested in starting first in responding to questions? No, but don't worry, you don't have to do it all. Anything you want to pick up, and I'll get to all of you in reverse order. Yeah. So please, Vera.
I'm not going to respond to all of it because there was a lot, but I think that in terms of knowledge and science as a knowledge form, one of the things that we've done in terms of water is build this whole concept of activist citizen science, and breaking down the science is separate, it's in a lab and it's done separately, bringing it to people and for people to understand, having access. So we're democratizing the science in a sense. The other wonderful thing that has resulted in is the recognition of indigenous knowledge and how people have understood the environment and all of that, using that and that kind of cross relationship that has existed for that. In terms of the issue of, I agree, the economic development and the trajectory we're on has got to change. We are not at a point where we have enough land, enough soil, enough water to actually feed this kind of trajectory. So if we don't pull back and say we need to rethink it, we are heading into an abyss. We are heading into a disaster. And I like what you said, growth for what and for whom, because there's this big divide of majority of South Africans do not have access to that growth in any way. And I do think we do a lot in terms of information for policymakers. I do think there's a lot of research, there's a lot of activism. Activism is not just the loud hailer and doing. It's also the research, it's also the kind of putting advocacy around policies that has helped. And I do think that sometimes it's in the case of South Africa, I'm sorry, but I feel it's not about policymakers not having enough information. It's the policymakers not interested in that information. They're interested in the next tender, and that's the reality for me on the ground. And then spatial planning, we really need to rethink our spatial planning. It's not just about building more cities. We need to look at how we make more, I want to use the word sustainable, but resilient cities. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much. As we've heard from Feriel, we move to our son of rain.
So from my part, I would just encourage the following: evidence-based decision making. That's what, because all the questions, when I look at them, what should policy makers do? How do we develop better? How do we ensure growth? How do we account for 1 more million people who came into the portion of Johannesburg? I'll just answer all of them in just that. Evidence-based decision making. Let policymakers make decisions based on evidence. If they do not have evidence, please go and look for the evidence. South Africa has a lot of institutes. SANSA is there. Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, CSIR, is there. University academia is there. Society is there. So as long as we make decisions and we allocate resources based on information that isn't concrete or scientific, we are going to experience more problems. Right now, we have, especially in Mamelodi, Tembisa area, Alex as well. There are areas which have the people there experience flooding. Their shacks were washed away, but they came back. Why? Right? So which means that the decisions that were made first on removing the people, it was probably emergency services say we're trying to save your life, we're just going to move you here. Afterwards, then the decision made, no enforcement was made to say, don't go. Right? So another thing was probably where the others, where they are being placed, you find that it's far away from where they work. So they're like, I'd rather go back and stay in that particular river stream because I can walk to the factory where I'm working. I mean, I can walk there. So evidence-based decision making. That's all I can say.
Thank you so much. As we get Miriam to join us also, let's be aware, it's not just from now that we are talking about even these specific areas. Mid-90s, I was head of policy at the CSR. That specific community saw for the first time Silicon Graphics, new boxes that they brought to South Africa that allowed us to animate. There's no big AI involved in this. It was taking photographs, putting them together and making them move. And we showed people, like you did on a satellite picture, which shacks were going to be flooded. As an inevitable consequence. Our expectation, this was from the science part, we did our job. We expected the built technologies, the built environment people to now plan such that people don't return to a floodplain. So there's that element which people have referred to. I think we should extend what consequence management actually means, because it includes these aspects as well. So, Mary?
Yeah, I'll start by the policy question to say that I think I am confident in writing a policy brief or selling the ideas of the research that I've done about intersectionality and its importance. I think innovation research shows that there is that gap between data production in universities or institutions of research and its usage by policymakers. So I think I would want to adopt a United Nations approach to say when you produce data, you need to sell it to the ones who are supposed to consume it, rather than to leave it to just gather dust. So I am confident in that intersectionality is a very important aspect in disaster management. It has been used, but its usage has been fragmented. United Nations, UN Women, yes, has actually done a study on women, but it did it on Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Malawi, on applying an intersectional lens to vulnerability of women. Even here in South Africa, there are several studies that have been done, but however, its importance has not been highlighted. So I do believe that I'm confident that I can actually write a policy brief regarding this one. And then when it comes to artificial intelligence, whether it's growing or it's important, I'd want to say that whether we like it or not, I believe artificial intelligence is growing by the day. If we think of ChatGPT or any AI that we had a few years ago now, it has changed. And we have a lot of AI that is like coming up each and every day. I'd want to believe it's the same feeling that we may have today, that back in the day, people heard about a calculator to say that if you use a calculator, you're not using your mind. But today, we are all using calculators with no guilt or shame to say I'm So I would want to believe that artificial intelligence is here to stay. Better think of how best we can leverage it for policy making. So even myself, when I was using it or when I was talking about it, I knew of the misgivings that are inherent in artificial intelligence, but I assumed a pragmatic approach to say it's very important because it serves a purpose and help us to shed more light of the vulnerabilities that are inherent in disaster management. Thank you.
Thanks. Miriam, we're going to come to you next, and then some as well. But Sanela has two comments that have come in as well. Please, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Prof. We have two online questions from Fisi. So the first one is saying, would we say that funding and institutional capacity are sufficient for disaster preparedness, or do they rely on underlying social cohesion to work effectively? And then the second one, it says, regarding the mention of social agents and disaster agents, how social relationships and community dynamics influence the effectiveness of disaster response at the local government level?
Thanks so much. So, hello, if you don't mind, just in time as well. Questions, so encourage towards that.
Sure, okay. So with the 15 minutes I've been at. So no, very quickly. So Joel, you've met Ferry. Very quickly. I think the thing about polycrisis has been this being used for everything. But and I don't want to sound like a purist, I think, because it's like the similar situation we have with scenarios where everyone says, oh, we need a scenario for this and that. They're like, and I think the MISTRA colleagues know there's a strict kind of definition of scenario, but we understand that. But I think in the broader use of it, and I think most times, although we kind of use it broadly, what we're actually saying is talking about interconnectedness of the various levels of the crisis we need to address. So one really good example of scenarios and crisis was MISTRA at the moment is working with a number of philanthropic organizations on addressing foundational education, very strictly defined education at that level. And you can imagine all these crises we've spoken about: climate, inequality, poverty, infrastructure, all that hits this most vulnerable part of the population hard. And it was good to actually use the scenarios, because initially, the colleagues that had asked us to do the work, we were skeptical. I think then yesterday they admitted, as the scenarios are completed and the strategy emerging, that you can actually use scenarios to start developing and forcing you to look at new questions, which is what they admitted to as well yesterday, that they haven't thought about this before. We've been busy looking at how we can improve and deliver and that kind of thing. So my sense is that few things. If you have a challenge and if you have money, consult MISTRA. That's our resource mobilization office. No, and secondly, I think when approaching this thing of polycrisis, we try and keep the broad canvas in mind, and then keep in mind the various tools that's possible to start addressing the issues we try to address. Thank you so much.
As Zama is going to say, there is the question that was posed by the colleague from the SABC. I suppose there are immediate dimensions to the question, and those are the decisions that Minister of Finance and others will be taking today and tomorrow before people rush to the pumps. But there is the broader question. We are meeting here all convinced about the importance of the low carbon transition, but we're using oil, carbon, energy for some time to come. Is there a balance that can be struck between the exploration that is being attempted, the activism of people in society who even take government to court to block exploration? Is there a balance that can be struck given these challenges? To the two editors.
No pressure.
But thanks very much. You know where the question should have been posed most directly, especially if those characters are going to be meeting. Saying that not with a huge amount of disrespect, because this is something that's been brewing over a long time. You know, we've been boiled slowly in both the issues about what is carbon intensity and the fact that zero is impossible. We are all carbon-based. So there's no zero possibility unless we want to liquidate ourselves. So the question is in the spectrum between what is possible and what is tolerable. We can wean ourselves off this addiction on oil over time. Yes. And that's where the second largest economy under capitalist terms, but the largest in terms of actually delivering to its people, is the People's Republic of China, which balances against this long-term challenges versus what takes place pragmatically towards that end. It's sequencing.
Yeah. And
the sequencing doesn't work on 5-year term limits, let alone elections that we as human beings think that's our democracy. Our democracy is also life. And if we are serious about it, maybe the question we need to pose to those standing for elections and this huge plethora of political parties is what's their position relative to these questions? You know, that may actually help us post the elections in terms of how we engage with it. But our system may not be configured to allow for that. We continue to use a transitory mechanism now solidified into governance. What was used for the transition needs to be left with the transition itself. By now, we need to learn from everyone else. At that time, sorry, Zama, what time was it? People proudly said, we have the best constitution, as in 1996. We are 20 years later, and we still say the same. No. 20 years later. But, so, not answering the question for you.
Oh, it does answer it.
Okay, so I want to touch on Sandy's question about growth and answering from innovations studies. So there is that, there is the innovation, the National Innovation System that has been taken up as this thing that will help us grow the economy. But since that, there's been African scholars and scholars in other global south countries who have said it needs to be an inclusive innovation system because where we are, obviously our context is different. So we need to ensure that the system that we adopt or the system that we develop is actually speaking to our issues. And because the previous version of a system of innovation doesn't take into account, inclusivity in human development. It just takes into account economic growth, but then obviously we know that it leaves other people behind. So then the whole conversation is how then do we then implement a more inclusive innovation system that will ensure that marginalized people don't stay in the margins, and also the environment. It also includes that we cannot continue the way we have in terms of just damaging the environment. So that is how I'd answer that. And then in terms of, I think suddenly we said the question was about whether there's enough institutional funding, and that is a big no, there isn't. And I think a couple of chapters even speak to that. And yeah, I think some of my colleagues have said that there isn't enough funding, and also the way funding is allocated needs to be looked at. And then in terms of the catch-22 about AI and water, what I can say is our next project is on AI.
What's that space?
So watch that space. That is definitely something that we want to look deep into.
Thank you very much, Sama and Rasika, and all the authors for what we've heard today, and to everybody who's joined us in the room and online. We are running out of time. We are over time, if we are brutally frank. So I'm not going to talk at length. Sama began by introducing the key themes in the book, and I think you've heard today the speech has been such an excellent illustration of how little pieces of each theme are reinforced. Like Joel and Sandy, my job at MISTRA is to read all the chapters. So I can just tell you that this has been only a very brief insight into what is truly a fascinating book, if we say so ourselves. And I'm going to mention only the chapters of the three authors who are present with us, but who haven't had a chance to speak today, as an example of this. Lawrence's chapter offers concrete examples of when disasters can produce positive social reform. Naeem's is such an interesting explanation of how different cultures and traditions understand disasters. And Roman's, where are you, Roman? Offers, you heard talk about what we do with uncertainty, about how we can't us. And his chapter offers such pertinent and interesting metaphors for how we understand and take action around this. And as a tease, I'll tell you, he offers us the tuxedo fallacy, which situates us like somebody in a casino about to play roulette. To find out more about that, you're just going to have to fork out for the book. And I've got good news on that front for people in the room and online. The book will cost $395 in the bookstores, or if you purchase it subsequently. But today, we have a launch offer, only 300 Rand, special for you for the next 48 hours. So take advantage. Thank you very much, everyone. Back to you, Susan.
I thought my phone there, find it like, how are you doing?
Oh, and please join us for the refreshments, which you have earned well by sitting here today.